what's happening now with the centralization of power and the circumventing of the parliamentary process and the reliance, let's say, on opinion polls and whim, and the abdication of responsibility for governing to so-called experts who are unidimensional in their viewpoint, that's the status quo, and that's becoming more and more the norm.
We have to reform the system more, and we can go with other political parties or reform the existing ones so that these leaders understand and revise their platforms to get back to what is true parliamentary democracy in our country.
To some degree, the idea of right itself is predicated on the idea of, I would say, it's something approximating the divine worth of each individual, which is what makes us equal before the law. There's some confusion about the derivation of the rights. Are these rights that are granted to you by your government, or do you have those rights to begin with as a consequence, let's say, of something approximating your relationship with the divine, and then the government can impose limitations on that only where that's practically necessary. But I suppose the inclusion of that preamble is one of the acts that was taken and articulated properly to put the idea of the intrinsic worth of the individual on something like metaphysical grounds. So it's a precondition. It's a precondition for the existence of the body of laws and the Constitution itself.
Exactly, and that's extremely important. And I deliberately introduce this now because I know hardly anybody else in discussing the Charter and the Constitution Act of 1982 have done so. But
that's partly why freedom of religion is so important. There's no difference between freedom of religion and freedom of belief. And there's no difference between freedom of belief and the capacity for independent thought, but also the right to follow the dictates of your own conscience.
Exactly. And so therefore, it's in the totality of the Charter. And so all of this is extremely important in knowing who we are as Canadians and how we're going to function as human beings in some democratic structure into the future, because our democratic structure will be significantly reduced if we lose on having these provisions of the Charter honored again.
You're also making the case that there's been a tremendous abdication of responsibility on the part of our political leaders, and also the circumvention of our parliamentary processes, which is dangerous procedurally and also a threat to our liberty.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And that's where the educational system, the whole totality of our society comes into play, and the various parts to that society which make it function better. And one of the great areas is in education. When I taught grade 8 back in the late 1960s in Springdale, Newfoundland, I introduced civics. There was no civics in the class in school even back then. I introduced it. There was within the Department of Education's curriculum guidelines the opportunity, if any school or teacher wanted to teach it, there was some materials available on civics, and you could teach a course. And I went to the principal and asked if I could teach it. This is back in the late 1960s. So the gradual erosion of our educational system to necessarily include, right, a course on the governance and on the system of government at the municipal, provincial, and federal level was missing.
Even then.
And continued to be even worse as time went on, and the history got taken out of the course, out of the curriculum, and some fusion of social studies got
right. Well, the whole principle.
And so on it went ever since then.
The principle of the sovereignty of the individual and then the associated sovereignty of the people, that principle cannot abide unless sovereign individuals take responsibility for governance. And cheap cynicism is no excuse for not engaging in that process. I mean, I've been struck through my whole life, talking to young people in particular, about their feelings of powerlessness and their separation in some sense from the day-to-day operations of the state. And I got involved in a political party when I was very young. I was 14. It was with the NDP in Alberta with Grant Notley. And that was all about the same time that you were operating on the processes that we're describing now. And one of the things that absolutely shocked me, even back then when I was that young, was how hungry the political parties were for anyone's involvement, how welcoming they were if you wanted to get involved, and how much scope of movement was available to you as a private citizen, almost at your beck and call if you were willing to involve yourself in the political process. Now, I don't think young Canadians They certainly haven't been taught that that's the case. And they certainly haven't been guided through the training processes necessary to make them aware of the availability of that. But it's also partly to be laid at the feet of Canadians. Is like, you could be involved in the political process if you just asked and wanted to be. It's not like these parties aren't crying out for workers, volunteers, and you can move up the ranks very quickly if you're competent. So, so there's no excuse for that not happening.
No, absolutely. But the educational system is partly to blame because we're taught up through, before we become an adult and want to get involved in the political parties, we have, a complete ignorance of how the process works. Even the political parties work, like you say, or how the municipal council works, or the school board works, or the province works. What powers do the provinces have? What provinces, the powers that the federal government have? How are we different from the United States of America, which is the elephant that lives next door to us? We should know all of these things. And this should be a course, developed from grade 7 or 8 up to the last year of high school, so that when people graduate, they have a knowledge and an understanding that they can then pursue through university and so on.
Yeah,
and active participant in the civic process.
Exactly. Well, we have vague courses that are in the political ideological domain that basically concentrate on something approximating the vague horrors of the past, not that those aren't real. And not that we shouldn't take responsibility for them, but they're no substitute for detailed knowledge of the actual structures of governance. And there's certainly no substitute for the deep respect that should be part and parcel of every Canadian's political view for the integrity of the institutions that have enabled us to live in peace and prosperity for, the entire expanse of Canadian history internally, and then in the much broader Western world for hundreds of years before that.
Yeah, exactly. But what has also happened is that we have the individual, because of the nature of governments over the last 40 years, where the state has taken on more and more say in the operation, not only of the society generally, but even of the economy and everything that goes with it, plus everything else, is that the sovereignty of the individual, the importance of the individual, your individual action, your individual decisions have become less and less and less. And so individuals feel somewhat powerless because the state has taken over almost every aspect of your life. And so every time there's a problem, what is some politician doing about it? Not what am I doing about it as an individual?
And how do you think if you had your will and you were acting in accordance with the idea that someday the sun will shine and have not will be no more, what do you think Canadians should do? What would you recommend for them to do?
I would recommend the following. Please don't go down a bunch of rabbit holes talking about a monarchy of 100 years ago. I get all this all the time, that Canada's only a corporation, it's not really a country and all of that. Stick with what we know for sure. And we know we have a constitution and 2 written documents, one when we were formed, another in 1981. They are documents that were passed legally through parliamentary democracies, and they have been exercised, they have been used. So the very fact that they've been used makes them a reality, because part of our constitution is also custom and convention, and that custom and convention proves that what we have is valid. Okay, Canadians must start to really activate their civic responsibilities in a huge way, and then involve themselves in legitimate organizations who are open and free, that are going to help you do this kind of protest.
So you're saying that we should trust the basic institutions. We should have faith in them because they've worked for us in the past. They've united our country and are drawn from a tradition that has united countries for long before that, and that we should start using them properly and responsibly.